The night my bookstore burned, Detective Asher Lane wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and told me to trust him, and I believed him because his voice was steady while everything else crackled and failed. I believed him because his eyes found mine through smoke the way a lighthouse finds a drenched swimmer and refuses to blink. I believed him until I sat in his office 3 weeks later and saw my wine-red diary on his desk. The soft leather pocked with a candle wax scar I'd made on a lonely New Year's, my handwriting curling at the edges where I press too hard when I'm worried, and when I asked how it got there, he said, "Evidence from the scene?" Even though I had hidden it under a floorboard at home before the fire, and that was the first hairline crack in the faith I kept trying to mortgage. I told him the diary was private, and he said, "Then tell me what's missing from it," which was an impossible question that made my ribs feel like a birdcage. So began the quiet chase where nothing wore the right name. The precinct called the arson suspicious but inconclusive. The insurance investigator wore a smile that didn't touch his eyes. My ex-employee Ben, recently hired by a hardware store that sold the same brand of accelerant the lab swore was used, glared at me across a counter and said I'd ruined his life. And Asher drove me there in an unmarked sedan and let me sit in the passenger seat and ask the kinds of questions you only ask when you already know the answers. We left with a receipt trail that looked incriminating until it wasn't. The accelerant bought for lawn care, and the timing explained by a girlfriend who kept texts like she kept coupons. And Asher said in the car, "People repeat the words that haunt them." He kept saying ruined, and I said the person I'd ruined was me, and he didn't flinch. Just handed me a coffee and told me to lock my doors and call him, not dispatch, if another letter arrived. And even though I heard the possessive in that instruction, I also heard protection, and I wanted both. The second letter came in a plain package hand-delivered to my stoop. No postmark, no mercy, containing a charred wood heart and 5 words in looping ink. "You forgot whose story you stole." Asher stood in my living room moments later, sleeves rolled, examining the note with gloved fingers while my cat Clementine hid under the couch like a rumor. And when he asked permission to sweep the apartment for your safety, I watched him read my life as if it were a crime scene. The paintbrushes drying in a jar. The photo of my parents outside the shop the day we opened. The seascape over my bed signed MH, and he tapped the signature and said, "Same initials as the anonymous letters." And I told him they were mine before they were anyone's, and that coincidences cluster in broken weeks. That night, after he left the scent of cedar and coffee behind, I pulled out the spare journal he didn't know about and wrote that the detective said to trust him, but my pulse begged me to inventory every door. The next morning, a city permit clerk phoned to say a development company, Harbor and Bell, had been canvassing the block to buy old storefronts, and I remembered the zoning article I'd drafted but never published because my source, initialed A in my diary, had asked for time. The red herring smelled like corporate paper and fresh paint. A slick Harbor and Bell rep named Carden smiled too much and called me Miss Hart like he'd practiced, apologized that the offer to buy my shop never reached you, and suggested tragic accidents sometimes accelerate change in a tone that made me see my shelves as bones. I ran straight to Asher and he said, "Slow down," and asked if I had proof beyond a bad feeling. Then promised to pull their security footage if it keeps you from doing anything rash. And I almost told him about the Thursday meetings down by the pier where gulls screamed like gossip, and an ethics officer in a cheap suit told me things you don't say into phones, about padded bids, bribes dressed as donations, fire inspections that vanished into stacks no one checked. But the way Asher pressed his thumb against the inside of his wrist when he thought made me hesitate. Because that was the same tell Elias Marlowe, his late partner, had when he used to drop by my shop and ask how the poetry section was breathing. A week later, hunting answers like a tide hunts shore. I went to the precinct to ask the records clerk for the official evidence log, and there it was in black and white. No diary listed, not under personal effects, not under salvage, not anywhere that would justify its presence on a detective's desk. When I asked Asher again, he said it was logged differently and that it had been sent to the lab, but the ribbon tail peeking from his bottom drawer made my skin buzz. I told myself I was imagining things. Trauma paints monsters on wallpaper, but the next day I found a microtransmitter glued under my aunt's champagne flute from the night of the fire, and though it could have clung there anywhere between the scene and my sink, the shape of it looked like a period at the end of a sentence I didn't remember writing. I marched into Asher's office angry enough to scare my own name, and he surprised me by taking me to a diner by the harbor and answering what I hadn't voiced. Maya, half of the entries in your diary were torn out before the fire, he said over eggs that went cold. And you didn't notice because whoever took them left you just enough to believe it was whole. And when I stared at him in hurt and disbelief, he folded and unfolded his napkin with that old tell and said, Elias gave it to me the week before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I had to keep you breathing. And the room tilted because that meant my mentor had been carrying my secrets like an extra lung until fate took one. And because it meant Asher had read every confession I'd ever written in that soft red book and still brought me coffee at dawn. The midpoint twist unspooled with a detail I'd pretended wasn't a detail. He said one of the torn pages had A's full name on it, Adrian North, the ethics officer, and a hand-drawn map of the pier with an X by Doc C, and I nearly choked because I'd only ever written his first name and the initial. Never the whole, not even once, and Asher said quietly, You didn't? But Elias did. And I felt the cold bloom of understanding. Someone else had been writing in my diary. Someone else had been in my apartment. Someone else had pulled up my floorboard and put it back exactly wrong. I ran then, not far, just to the restroom where I sobbed into paper that smelled like lemons. And when I came back, Asher's eyes were softer and more dangerous than I'd ever seen them as he said, There's something else. Adrian North died last Thursday. They called it an accident. But men who intend to live don't step backward off piers. And the dark night began in a space smaller than breath. I accused Asher of using me to bait whoever killed his partner, said he'd kept my diary to keep my leash short. And he lifted his hands, palms out, and said, I kept it because your handwriting was the last steady thing Elias touched. And the way he said it took the fight out of me like a plug in a bath. We drove in silence to my apartment and found the door not quite closed, the deadbolt scarred, the air wrong. The kind of wrong that smells like someone else's shampoo and letters moved half an inch to the left. The place was ransacked with care, drawers emptied and refilled, couch cushions unzipped and zipped again, professional, patient, creepingly polite. On my kitchen table, a single page rested like an exhibit, a photocopy of a page from my diary I had not written and could not deny. You built your store on someone else's ashes. Except the A wasn't Adrian's tidy serif but a kindergarten swoop, and for the first time I considered the possibility that A stood for arsonist, not alley. The forced proximity became literal. Asher insisted I leave with him. You're not safe here. And I said I had Clementine, and he said, She's already in her carrier, and I laughed like a person who can hear the brittle in her own bones. He took me to a safe house above a closed bakery that smelled like sugar even at midnight, a narrow apartment with clean towels and furniture that knew how to be quiet. He turned off the lights and stood by the window watching the street while I sat at the small table with a borrowed pen, and we pretended to breathe. Somewhere between two and never, we spoke like people who have earned the right to be specific. I told him about my father teaching me to lay book spines gentle so they wouldn't crack, and about the night I almost published Adrian's story, and he asked me to wait because he feared for his children. He told me Elias used to hum when he read statements, a tuneless, soothing hum that made witnesses tell the truth harder and longer, and that he hadn't slept a whole night since his partner's car hit water with no skid marks on dry road. When morning broke across the neighbor's fire escape like coins, I found a resolve waiting for me like shoes by the bed. I was tired of playing defense. I told Asher to take me to Doc C. He said no, and then, when I looked at him the way a tide looks at a brittle cliff, he said fine, but I had to stay behind him and touch nothing. The pier at noon was a bright lie, gulls delirious, tourists taking pictures of water as if it were an exhibit. But at Dock C the boards whispered underfoot and the smell turned from salt to metal. Beneath the planks, tucked in the shadow where barnacles grow spite, Asher found a plastic capsule wired to the post with fishing line. And inside, wrapped in a zip bag and arrogance, lay a small SIM card and a folded receipt from a storage facility across town, rented under a fake name I recognized only after I said it out loud. Elias. The storage unit number was the date he'd joined the force, which meant it was either a breadcrumb he left to help us, or a breadcrumb someone else planted to break us. The fair play reveal began to assemble itself like the kind of puzzle whose pieces never actually hid. Harbor and Bell's bid schedules, zoning delays, accidental fires in blocks they coveted, an insurance adjuster whose brother married into their board, anonymous letters that drove me to doubt myself, and a dead ethics officer who told me once that the cleanest money he'd ever seen was laundered through a scholarship fund named for a saint who would have hated them. When we reached the storage facility, Asher flashed a badge and a look, and the clerk handed over a key with shaking hands. The unit smelled like coal dust and old paper. Inside were banker's boxes labeled with Elias's tight block letters, HB zoning, SHB fire, HB mnemonics. And that last one made me go very still because inside lay not files but 3 items. A tiny bell of tarnished brass, a scrap of ribbon the exact red of my diary, and a photograph of me behind my counter taken from the sidewalk as if the window were a fish tank. On the back of the photograph, Elias had written, "If you're reading this, it means I was right about the bell and wrong about the fire. Maya, he'll come for you through your words. Lane, trust her instincts." My throat hurt in a new way. Asher said my name like a question, and I said, "He knew." And the grief in his face was not theatrical. In the box marked HB Fire, we found copies of inspection reports with signatures that didn't match and stamps a 0.5 millimeter off. Center, details that matter only to people who live on the margins between legal and not, and a scan of a donation ledger with entries circled. Payments to a charity called Harbor Bells Youth, which sounded lovely until you ran your finger across the dates and saw how each gift preceded a code, violation being deferred, and a list of phone numbers under the header Watchers, among them the number printed on the business card of the insurance investigator who had visited the ashes of my shop with sympathetic eyes, and tucked into the lid a micro drive labeled A. Asher locked the door from the inside, used his laptop, and for 5 long minutes I listened to the battery fan like a sigh while he decrypted what Elias had marked. And when the files opened, what spilled out was simple enough to be considered elegant by ugly men. Email chains between Harbor and Bell executives and a consultant arranging municipal persuasion, scans of cashier's checks to a shell company managed by our adjuster friend, a timetable for accelerated acquisition that slotted my block neatly between 2 litigation events, and a calendar entry the night before my fire that read, Bell Test, Hart, 0030. The bell. I stared at the tiny brass bell in the mnemonics box and rang it once just to feel insane. And somewhere in my body the memory unlatched. Standing in my dark shop at 12:30 to take an inventory photo, the bell on the door tinkling as I went out to the dumpster. The alley smelling faintly of gasoline, a man in a knit cap I had seen once at Harbor and Bell leaning against the fence. I had not forgotten. I had excused it. And I understood what Elias meant about coming for me through my words, the letters, the diary, the narrative bent until I didn't trust my own sentences. We were at the reveal line, the 80% cliff where the choices decide who you'll be when the credits roll, when footsteps approached outside, slow and measuring, and a voice said, "Detective Lane, this unit is registered to a deceased officer. Please open the door." And the voice belonged to the lieutenant who had offered me coffee the night I filed the first report. The same lieutenant who had told Asher to drop the case last week because resources. And in Asher's eyes, I saw the moment he understood the rot wasn't in the walls, but in the load-bearing beams. He motioned for silence, hit a key, and sent the entire contents of the drive to 3 places at once: Internal Affairs, a journalist he trusted, and a judge who owed Elias a favor. And then he did the most dangerous thing. He opened the door. The lieutenant stood with 2 uniforms who looked mortally tired and morally wobbly, and he smiled like an uncle at Christmas and said,
"You have something that belongs to Harbor and Bell." And the way he said their name like a prayer took all my remaining doubt and set it on fire.
"It belongs to the people you stole from," I said before Asher could speak, and the lieutenant's eyes slid to me as if I were a dog who'd learned a new trick. He raised his hand and the uniforms shifted like a script called for it, and Asher did the math a good man does when the room goes feral. He stepped in front of me and said, "Then you'll have to come through me," and I hated him for saying it because I knew what it meant, that he was laying his body on my story, and I loved him for it. Because love sometimes looks like turning your chest into a door. The sacrificial choice came like a thrown glass. The lieutenant pulled a weapon with the casualness of a man reaching for his pen, and Asher yelled, "Down!" And I grabbed the bell and hurled it at the light switch, plunging the unit into the kind of dark where loyalties show up as heat. A shot cracked the air and blew a hole in the wall inches from my face, and dust sprinkled down like bleak confetti. Asher dragged a box over, kicked it at the lieutenant's legs, and lunged, and in the scuffle the brass bell rolled to my foot like a coin that had decided. I picked it up and ran, not away, but toward the hall where an alarm pull station waited behind a plastic cover, rang the bell as loud and fast as I could, and smashed the cover with it, yanking the lever, and suddenly the building did what honest buildings do when asked the right question. It screamed, sirens, strobes, doors unlocking by code. The uniforms hesitated, torn between orders and procedure, and Asher used their half-second of goodness to disarm the lieutenant with a move he'd probably sworn to his mother he'd never need again. Within minutes, though breath measured them like years, the hallway filled with smoke-gray suits who didn't smile, internal affairs among them, and the adjuster who'd been consulting with Harbor and Bell tried to leave by the stairwell and ran face first into a journalist with a camera and a judge with an emergency order. And just like that, the people who had lived under new names lost them to nameplates pinned on by other hands. It wasn't clean, because nothing good is. There were statements and tears, and the sight of Asher sitting on a curb afterward, holding the brass bell in his palm and looking at it like a relic from a church that saved his life and took his friend. But it was enough to make the city's head lift an inch. Later, after Clementine had forgiven the siren day and fallen asleep in a loaf on the safe house sofa, after the judge unsealed the drive and the newspaper ran a headline that made Harbor and Bell sound more like a shipwreck than a company, Asher knocked softly on the bedroom door where I'd been staring at my hands and said my name the way a person says a password they don't deserve to know. And I opened it because there are doors you open only once. His eyes were rimmed red from too little sleep and too much not crying. And when I asked, "Do you still want me to trust you?" he said, "Only if I keep earning it." And I stepped into him and he into me, and we stood there at the seam of fright and future until I laughed, a shock of sound like sunlight, and told him I'd kiss him if he promised not to write it in a report. He said he'd write it in the margins where only he could read it. And then I touched my mouth to his in a way that made everything else feel like rehearsal. And when we broke apart, he pressed my diary into my hands with both of his and said, "It's yours. It always was." And I understood that sometimes believing a man who tells you to trust him is not an act of surrender, but an act of co-authorship. A month later, the city granted emergency funds to rebuild independent shops. An ethics office got teeth. Harbor and Bell went by a different name in court and lost. The lieutenant resigned to spend time with family, no longer welcome at city bars, and I reopened my bookstore in a new space with windows that caught morning like a habit. And at noon on a Thursday, a man in a suit who hated lying walked in carrying a tiny brass bell, set it on the counter, and asked if we could hang it on the door so the shop would sing when people came home. I said yes, because love sounds like that. And when he kissed me across a stack of poetry about ships and storms, it was clean, honest, and warm. A punctuation mark that didn't end us but began the next sentence.